Precision bombing was a doctrine before it was a capability. The Boeing B-17 was built around the Norden bomb site, and the belief that a formation of heavily armed bombers, flying at altitude in daylight, could place bombs on industrial targets with sufficient accuracy to make the target unusable, without destroying the surrounding city, without requiring a fighter escort, and without the losses that had defined the Great War's ground campaigns. 10 machine guns and 4 engines and a crew of 10 men were the instruments of that belief. The belief was tested over Germany starting in 1942. The theory had required perfect conditions. The conditions were never perfect. 2 tons of bombs, 240 kilometers per hour, and a doctrine that assumed no fighter could catch it. The He-111 arrived at the Battle of Britain with a theory that the RAF disproved in weeks. Over Poland and France, the assumption held. Over Britain in 1940, it did not. The RAF's Hurricanes and Spitfires could not only catch the He-111, but destroy it faster than German industry could replace it. The Battle of Britain ended Germany's belief that medium bombers could operate without fighter escort over defended airspace. It was a lesson the Luftwaffe understood, but never fully solved, because the long-range escort fighter it needed was never built.
Fast was not enough. The Tupolev SB, Skorotsnoy Bombardirovщик, fast bomber, could outrun the biplane fighters of its era at 430 kilometers per hour, an achievement that made it the export choice of the Spanish Republic and China, and the backbone of Soviet bomber aviation entering the war. By June 1941, it was obsolete. 800 were lost in the first week of Operation Barbarossa. The doctrine that speed alone protected a bomber had been tested in Spain against inferior opponents and never revised. The Luftwaffe revised it for them in the summer of 1941. A newspaper proprietor's private aircraft became Britain's frontline bomber. Lord Rothermere had commissioned a fast executive transport from Bristol in 1934. When the Air Ministry saw how fast it was, they bought a military version. The Blenheim entered service in 1937 as the fastest aircraft in the RAF, faster than any fighter it was likely to encounter. By 1939, it was slower than the Bf 109 by 70 miles per hour. The speed advantage that had made the design attractive had been obsoleted before the war it was meant to fight had started. The Blenheim kept flying because there was nothing ready to replace it. One airframe for every mission Germany's bombers needed to perform. That was the design ambition of the Ju-88, and it was achieved well enough that 12,000 were built, and it remained in production from 1939 to 1945. No single version was the best at any one role. All versions were adequate at their assigned role and available when needed. The Ju-88 demonstrated a principle that aircraft with narrower specifications never proved. The bomber that could adapt to what the war became outlasted everyone that had been optimized for what the war was supposed to be.
Speed at the cost of payload. The Do-17 was called the Flying Pencil. Over Britain in 1940, the theory did not hold. The Do-17's thin fuselage gave it minimal defensive armament, and RAF fighters that could catch the He-111 could certainly catch the Do-17. Production ended in 1940, after fewer than 1,200 had been built. The Dornier's designers had optimized for one characteristic: speed, at the expense of the others a bomber needed to survive in contested airspace. The Battle of Britain proved that no single performance advantage compensated for the combination of deficiencies that accompanied it. The geodesic construction that Barnes-Wallis designed into the Wellington, a lattice of aluminium strips that distributed structural loads across the entire airframe, produced a bomber that could absorb battle damage that would have destroyed any conventionally built aircraft. Wellingtons returned from missions with sections of fuselage shot away that left nothing but the geodesic framework exposed.
over 4,000 were built. They began the war as the RAF's primary night bomber and ended it training crews for the 4-engine aircraft that replaced them. The aircraft that could be repaired and flown again mattered more than the one that was marginally faster or slightly more capable.
Vladimir Petlyakov designed the PE-2 in a prison camp. Arrested as an enemy of the people in 1937 during Stalin's purges, he was given a choice between continued imprisonment and the delivery of a high-altitude interceptor within a specified time. He produced a twin-engine dive bomber instead, recognizing that Soviet operational requirements had changed. The PE-2 entered service in 1940 as the best tactical bomber the Soviet Union had built. Fast, maneuverable, capable of precision attacks in support of ground forces. Petlyakov did not survive to see the production peak. He died in a PE-2 crash in January 1942 under circumstances that were never fully explained. The siren was a psychological weapon.
The Junkers Ju-87 was a slow, fixed-gear aircraft with poor defensive armament and no ability to operate in contested airspace without fighter escort. And it was devastatingly effective in every campaign from Poland to North Africa, where that escort was provided. The screaming Jericho trumpet mounted on its fixed undercarriage was fitted specifically to create panic among troops on the ground, because the aircraft's designers understood that the primary target of close air support was not infrastructure, but morale. Remove the escort, as happened over Britain in 1940, and the Stuka became a liability. The aircraft was only as effective as the doctrine that deployed it.
3 minutes on the 4th of June 1942
destroyed Japan's offensive naval capability. The SBD Dauntless dive bombers that found the Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu at Midway, caught them with aircraft on deck being rearmed and fueled, delivered their bombs in steep dives that left no time for maneuver, and left 3 fleet carriers burning in the time it took to execute a single attack run. The Dauntless was not a fast aircraft. It was slower than most fighters it encountered. It was an accurate one. At Midway, that method proved more effective than any precision bomb sight operating from altitude. The aircraft had never been designed to operate from a carrier. It could not land on one. The crews flew on to China, where most crash-landed or bailed out because there was nowhere else to go. The Doolittle raid caused minimal physical damage to Japan and demonstrated that medium bombers could be adapted to missions their designers had never specified. The B-25 went on to become the most versatile medium bomber of the war. Naval strike in the Pacific, close support in Italy, anti-shipping in the Mediterranean, proving that an adaptable airframe in the hands of crews who understood its limits could find a role in almost any theater. Early crews called it the Widowmaker. The Martin B-26 Marauder had the highest wing loading of any American bomber when it entered service in 1941, which gave it high speed and required a landing approach so fast that pilots who misjudged it died. Training accident rates in 1942 prompted a congressional investigation and nearly killed the program. The aircraft that had been considered too dangerous to fly became the safest American bomber in combat. The pilots who mastered it swore by it. The transition from Widowmaker to Workhorse was not achieved by redesigning the aircraft. It was achieved by learning to fly the one that existed. More bombs to more targets with fewer mechanical failures and lower crew losses than any other aircraft in Bomber Command. The Lancaster carried 7 tons of bombs, could accept the 10-ton Grand Slam earthquake bomb that no other aircraft could lift, and flew 7,377 sorties on the Berlin raid of the 20th of January 1944. More aircraft committed to a single target on a single night than in any previous RAF operation. It was not the aircraft that the specification demanded. The specification had asked for a twin-engine bomber. Lancaster's designers installed 4 engines because 4 worked better. The Air Ministry accepted the result, more sorties over Germany than any aircraft except the Lancaster. And its crews did not receive proportionate credit for it. The Air Ministry considered withdrawing it from the strategic campaign in 1943. Crew modifications, a new nose, extended wingtips, improved engines, transformed the Halifax from a liability into a capable strategic bomber that flew until the war ended. 69 Halifax crews won the Victoria Cross. The aircraft they flew was consistently treated as a second choice. The comparison to the Lancaster was unfair to everyone who died in a Halifax doing the same work, at greater risk in a less celebrated airframe. More B-24s were built than any other American combat aircraft. 18,482 total across all variants. B-24 crews in the 8th Air Force flew the same missions as B-17 crews, received less public attention, and died in comparable numbers. At Ploesti in August 1943, 178 B-24s attacked Romanian oil refineries at low level, in a mission that was simultaneously one of the most costly and most decorated in American aviation history. The refineries were repaired within weeks. The 5 Medals of Honor awarded after the mission were the most given for a single action in the Second World War. The Sterling was the first 4-engine heavy bomber to enter RAF service, and the first to be withdrawn from strategic bombing because its ceiling of 17,000 feet placed it below the German flak concentrations and night fighter altitudes that the Lancaster and Halifax could avoid. The engineers who designed the Sterling knew the ceiling was inadequate. They built it to the specification they were given. By 1943, Sterling crews were flying below the aircraft that were supposed to be protecting them, into the heaviest concentrations of defensive fire, with losses that exceeded any reasonable operational standard. The Sterling was replaced by the aircraft the original specification should have required. Wood, twin Merlin engines, no defensive guns, and a speed that made interception nearly impossible. The Mosquito proved that the correct response to the problem of bomber survivability was not armor or armament, but performance. De Havilland proposed the design in 1938 and was rejected because the Air Ministry did not believe an unarmed bomber could survive. The prototype flew in November 1940 and was faster than any RAF fighter. It flew day raids that the B-17s could not survive, night raids that the Lancasters found difficult, and low-level precision attacks that nothing else attempted. The aircraft that the Air Ministry didn't want became the most versatile combat aircraft Britain produced. 5 years of German engineering produced a heavy bomber that killed its crews before the enemy did. The He 177 Greif, Griffin, was designed to dive bomb at low level before climbing to release from altitude, a requirement that forced the engineers to couple 2 engines onto a single crankshaft on each wing, producing a power plant that caught fire with regularity that crews found difficult to distinguish from enemy action. 935 were built. The fundamental design flaw, the coupled engine, was never resolved. Germany's strategic bomber program produced an aircraft that its own crews nicknamed the Flaming Coffin and feared more than any Allied fighter. On the 8th of August 1941, 66 days after the German invasion, Soviet Ilyushin DB-3F bombers, the IL-4's direct predecessor, reached Berlin. From bases in Estonia that were about to be captured in a mission that Stalin ordered for political reasons over the objections of commanders who knew the aircraft could barely reach the target and might not return. 5 aircraft reached Berlin. Soviet propaganda announced a major raid. The EL-4 flew on through the war in long-range attacks on Romanian oil refineries, Finnish cities, and German supply lines, accumulating a combat record that the operational conditions made far more costly than the results justified. Range meant removing armor. Range meant removing self-sealing fuel tanks. The G4M carried 900 kilograms of bombs, or a torpedo over approximately 5,700 kilometers at combat radius, a reach that no other naval bomber matched. And it burned so readily when hit that Allied pilots called it the Flying Lighter. The torpedoes it carried sank HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse on the 10th of December 1941, the first capital ships sunk by air attack while underway and able to maneuver. The G4M proved that range-extended air power could kill warships that had no air cover. The price was paid by the crews who flew it.
The Tu-2 was what Soviet bomber design became after 4 years of war had revealed every deficiency of what preceded it. Fast enough to operate without escort in some conditions, capable of precision attacks that the PE-2 could perform and the IL-4 could not, and reliable enough to maintain operational tempo across the distances the Eastern Front demanded, the Tu-2 entered service in 1944, as the aircraft the Soviet bomber force had been working toward since 1941. Fewer than 800 reached frontline units before the war ended. The Tu-2 fought the war's final year and outlasted it, serving in Soviet and Chinese air forces into the 1950s. It was the right answer, delivered at the war's end. The Val sank more Allied warships than any other Axis aircraft in the war. The Aichi D-III entered service in 1940 as Japan's primary carrier dive bomber, a fixed-gear biplane-influenced design whose elliptical wing produced exceptional maneuverability for the role, and its crews struck Pearl Harbor, Colombo, Trincomalee, and the carrier HMS Hermes in the Indian Ocean raid of April 1942. It was replaced by the Yokosuka D-IV Suisei, but never fully retired, because Japan was losing carriers faster than it could replace them, and the aircraft that flew from the carriers that remained flew whatever was available. The Val ended the war as a kamikaze platform. Faster than most fighters it would encounter, the Ginga was designed in 1940 as Japan's land-based torpedo bomber, with the range to strike Allied fleet units across the Pacific at distances that shore-based aircraft could not cover. The Ginga required skilled pilots to manage its demanding handling characteristics that killed crews in training and continued killing them in combat. 220 were built. The aircraft that should have been Japan's answer to the range problem of naval strike warfare arrived after the strategic situation had made the question irrelevant. Japan was no longer projecting power. It was defending its coastline. The B-29 was the most technically complex aircraft the United States built during the war. Pressurized cabin, remote-controlled gun turrets, engines that routinely caught fire in the early production batches, and a wing loading that required a landing approach so fast that runways had to be extended to accommodate it. Curtis LeMay took command of the 20th Air Force in January 1945 and changed everything. He stripped the B-29s of their guns and gunners to save weight, loaded them with incendiary bombs instead of high explosives, and sent them over Japan at low altitude at night. The precision bombing doctrine the B-29 had been built to execute had been abandoned before the atomic mission it is remembered for. In 1937, no carrier torpedo bomber in the world matched the B-5N. Faster than its American equivalents, longer ranged, and capable of operating the Type 91 torpedo that the shallow waters of Pearl Harbor had been considered to make impossible. Japan had developed a modified torpedo fin that solved the shallow water problem. American naval intelligence had assessed Pearl Harbor as too shallow for aerial torpedo attack. The Kate's crews arrived on the 7th of December 1941 and demonstrated that the assessment was wrong. By 1943, the Kate was outclassed by Allied fighters and increasingly vulnerable. The aircraft that had opened the Pacific War could not survive it. A racing aircraft became Italy's most effective naval strike weapon. The Savoia Marchetti SM-79 Sparviero entered service in 1936, flew for the Nationalists in Spain,
and emerged as Italy's primary bomber. Unremarkable in level bombing, exceptional in torpedo attack. Italian torpedo bomber crews using SM-79s sank more Allied shipping tonnage in the Mediterranean than any other Axis aircraft in that theatre. The technique of low-level torpedo release from a fixed-wing aircraft had been practiced and refined by Italian crews while the RAF was still treating torpedo bombing as secondary. Its torpedo doctrine influenced naval aviation for a decade after the war that proved it. The first jet bomber used in combat entered service over a Europe that had already been decided. The Arado AR-234 Blitz could fly at 840 kilometers per hour, faster than any Allied fighter that existed when it was designed, carry 1,500 kilograms of bombs, and conduct reconnaissance missions that could not be intercepted. The AR-234 bombed the Remagen Bridge in March 1945 in repeated attacks that failed to destroy it, and conducted reconnaissance over Britain in missions that demonstrated the jet's potential without altering any outcome. Germany had built the future of air power and deployed it after the present had already been lost. Goering insisted the Me-262 be used as a bomber. Hitler agreed. The engineers who had built the world's first operational jet fighter watched it converted to carry two 500-kilogram bombs that degraded its performance and negated the speed advantage that was its entire tactical value. The Schwalbe in its fighter role could not be caught by anything the Allies flew. The Sturmvogel bomber variant could be caught by propeller aircraft while carrying its bomb load, because the bombs forced it to fly slower approaches that Allied fighters had time to intercept. The Me-262 as bomber was the most expensive and least effective medium bomber Germany deployed. On the 6th of August 1945, a single B-29 flew from Tinian to Hiroshima, dropped one bomb, and killed between 70 and 80,000 people immediately. The crew wore darkened goggles and turned away from the blast. The city below them did not burn gradually from incendiaries, as Tokyo had, but was destroyed instantaneously by a pressure wave and thermal pulse that the physics of conventional bombing had no equivalent for. 3 days later, Nagasaki. Japan surrendered. The doctrine that bombing could end wars had been tested for 6 years. It had been proved correct, at a cost and by a method that no one writing the doctrine in the 1930s had imagined. The bombers that survived the war flew on into the Cold War, training the crews who would carry weapons the Second World War had made necessary. The B-29 became the B-50, which became the B-47, which became the B-52. The Lancaster became the Lincoln. The distinction between military target and civilian population that the early doctrine had been designed to maintain had not survived the war that tested it. The bombers of 1945 had not won a war by destroying industry. They had won it by making the cost of continuing too visible to bear. That was the doctrine every Air Force inherited.